as ball lightning.
Recently, terrifying scenes began unfolding in Turkey as the sky suddenly darkened, swallowed by massive black clouds, while fierce winds howled through the streets. Trees snapped, rooftops shook violently, and a powerful storm quickly began to form. Within moments, nature seemed to erupt in anger as heavy rain poured down, throwing several areas into chaos and leaving hundreds injured or without homes. Many witnesses said they had never seen the sky look so frightening. What exactly happened in Turkey? Was this simply a devastating storm, or something that caught the attention of the entire world? If you want to follow the full story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. At first, many people believed it was simply another storm forming over the region. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon were not unusual. But within minutes, it became clear that something about this sky felt different. And the change happened quickly. Across parts of Turkey, the bright daylight began to fade as massive clouds rolled forward from the distance. At first, they appeared as scattered shadows moving slowly across the sky. But then the clouds began to multiply, thickening and spreading with surprising speed. Within moments, they covered the horizon like a giant curtain of darkness. The sunlight that had filled the streets only minutes earlier began to disappear. The sky turned from pale blue to a deep, heavy gray. Buildings, streets, and rooftops slowly fell under a dim, eerie light that made the entire city feel unfamiliar. People began looking up. Some stopped walking in the middle of the street, staring at the sky as if trying to understand what was happening. Others pointed toward the growing mass of clouds pushing across the horizon. "It's getting dark too fast," someone said in a video that later spread online. And they were right. The darkness did not arrive gradually like a normal storm. It felt sudden, almost overwhelming, as if the sky itself had changed in only a few minutes. Then the wind arrived. At first it was only a light breeze brushing through the streets, but the air quickly grew restless. Gusts of wind began pushing between buildings, rattling signs and shaking tree branches. Leaves lifted from the ground and spun through the air. Shop signs clattered against their poles. Loose papers scattered across sidewalks. It was the kind of moment when people suddenly feel that something larger is approaching. Across neighborhoods, daily life began to change in seconds. Shop owners rushed outside and began pulling down metal shutters over their windows. Street vendors hurried to fold their tables and grab their umbrellas before the strengthening wind could tear them away. Families walking outside began heading home quickly. Parents called their children back inside. On balconies and rooftops, people rushed to bring things indoors. Laundry hanging peacefully in the sunlight moments earlier was quickly pulled down. Plastic chairs were stacked and carried inside. Flower pots were moved away from railings. Many residents later said they felt an uneasy instinct in that moment, a feeling that the storm approaching might be far stronger than usual. As the wind grew louder, some people remembered words written long ago in the Bible about storms like these. Now, as it is written in the book of Job, the tempest comes out from its chamber, and cold out of the north. Job 37:9. Above the city, the clouds continued moving like a massive wall spreading across the sky. The daylight was now almost completely gone. Cars began speeding through the streets as drivers tried to reach home before the weather worsened. A few residents stood outside briefly, staring at the horizon before quickly heading indoors. The wind now roared through the streets. Trees bent under the growing force of the air. Power lines hummed softly as gusts rushed past. And above it all, the sky continued to darken. From a distance, the clouds looked like a giant wave of darkness rolling toward the city. Many people would later say the same thing when they described that moment. At first, it looked like an ordinary storm. But what appeared next shocked everyone. Just as the sky over the city grew darker and the wind continued to build, and something unusual began to appear inside the storm clouds. At first, it was only a brief flash of light, something many people assumed was ordinary lightning forming inside the thickening clouds. Storms often bring sudden flashes across the sky, and most residents barely paid attention at first. But this light did not behave like normal lightning. Instead of striking down in a sharp, blinding line, the light seemed to gather itself into a glowing shape, a small sphere of bright energy suspended within the clouds. For a moment, it hovered. Several witnesses later said they thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. The glowing object appeared as a round ball of light moving slowly across the sky, drifting through the dark storm clouds like a floating lantern. It was not the quick flash of lightning people were used to seeing during a storm. This light remained visible for several seconds, glowing with an intense white and slightly orange color that stood out against the dark background of the clouds. People began pointing upward. Phones were quickly pulled from pockets as residents tried to capture what they were seeing. In several videos recorded that evening, a glowing sphere could be seen moving silently across the sky, flickering softly before fading and then appearing again moments later. Some witnesses could be heard reacting in disbelief. "Oh, what is that?" someone shouted from a balcony. Others simply stared, unsure how to explain what they were watching unfold above them. The glowing sphere moved slowly, almost calmly, drifting across the storm clouds as if carried by an invisible current in the air. For a few brief moments, it illuminated the clouds around it, casting faint flashes of light through the dark sky. Then, suddenly, it vanished. The sky returned to darkness for a few seconds. But then, it appeared again. Another glowing sphere, or perhaps the same one, flickered into view within the storm clouds, brighter this time. It moved across the sky before fading once more into the darkness. Scenes like this quickly began spreading online as witnesses uploaded their recordings. Within hours, the mysterious light became one of the most talked-about moments of the storm. Many viewers had never seen anything like it before. Scientists have long referred to rare phenomena like this as ball lightning, an unusual type of electrical discharge sometimes reported during intense storms. Unlike ordinary lightning that flashes and disappears instantly, ball lightning can appear as a glowing sphere that moves slowly through the air for several seconds. Even today, the phenomenon remains one of the least understood forms of lightning in nature. But for the people standing beneath those storm clouds in Turkey, scientific explanations were the last thing on their minds. What they saw felt strange, almost unreal, appearing just as the storm itself was growing stronger. Some people watching the sky quietly remembered another passage often quoted when speaking about lightning and storms. "For his lightning lights up the world. The earth sees it and trembles." Psalm 97. 4. Above the city, the storm clouds continued to churn as the wind grew stronger. The mysterious glowing lights had disappeared, but the feeling they left behind remained. Many witnesses later said that moment was when they realized something unusual was unfolding. The storm that had begun as dark clouds and rising wind now carried an element no one had expected. and the sky was only just beginning to show its power. The strange lights in the sky had barely faded when the storm finally unleashed its full force. What had begun as dark clouds and rising wind now transformed into something far more violent. The air grew heavier, and the wind that had been pushing gently through the streets suddenly surged with frightening strength. Within moments, powerful gusts roared through cities and villages across the region, rattling windows and shaking rooftops as if the storm itself had awakened. The wind grew stronger and stronger. Trees that had stood quietly only minutes earlier began to bend under the pressure. Their branches whipped violently through the air as gusts swept across roads, fields, and neighborhoods. Some trees could not withstand the force. One after another, large branches snapped with loud cracks, falling onto streets and cars below. In some places, entire trees were torn from the ground, their roots lifted from the soil as the storm pushed forward without mercy. Then, the rain began. At first it arrived as scattered drops, carried sideways by the wind. But within seconds the sky opened completely. Heavy rain poured down in sheets, striking rooftops, roads, and farmland with relentless intensity. Water rushed through the streets as drainage systems struggled to keep up. Puddles quickly turned into flowing streams running along sidewalks and across open ground. Visibility dropped almost instantly. Drivers slowed their cars as the rain pounded against windshields. Pedestrians ran for shelter beneath doorways and balconies, trying to escape the sudden downpour. Thunder rolled across the dark sky as lightning flashed deep within the storm clouds. Far beyond the cities, the powerful storm was also stirring the waters of the Black Sea. Strong winds sweeping across the surface began pushing waves higher and higher. What had been a restless sea only hours earlier now grew violent, with waves crashing against the coastline and harbors. Fishermen and coastal residents watched as the water level began to rise, driven by the growing storm system moving across the region. Back on land, the destruction continued to spread. Across orchards and farmland, the violent wind tore through fields that farmers had spent months cultivating. Fruit trees shook violently as the storm passed over them, sending apples, oranges, and other crops tumbling to the ground before they could be harvested. Branches heavy with fruit snapped under the pressure of the wind, scattering produce across the soil. In open fields, young crops bent low beneath the pounding rain. Some plants were flattened completely, their stems broken by the force of the storm. What had been green farmland only hours earlier now looked battered and torn, the result of wind and rain working together with relentless power. Livestock were not spared either. Farmers rushed to move animals into barns and shelters as the storm intensified, but many were caught in the open fields when the worst of the wind arrived. Chickens scattered in panic as gusts tore through farmyards. Sheep and cattle struggled to move against the powerful wind, some huddling together while rain poured down around them. The sound of the storm filled the air everywhere. Wind roared across rooftops. Rain hammered against metal and stone. Branches snapped in the darkness as trees continued to fall under the pressure of the storm. For many residents, it felt as though the entire landscape was shaking under the growing power of nature. Some who watched the storm unfold remembered words written long ago in the Bible, describing moments when nature itself seemed to rise with overwhelming force. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Psalm 29:3. Above Turkey, the storm system continued to grow and organize, its dark clouds swirling as powerful winds pushed it forward. What had begun as a dark sky and rising wind had now become a full-force storm spreading across land and sea. And this was only the beginning of the disaster. As the storm continued to unleash its power across northern Turkey, the rising waters of the Black Sea region began turning entire towns into scenes of desperation. The rain had not stopped for hours, and every minute the rivers swelled higher. What had first flooded roads and low fields now pushed deeper into neighborhoods, swallowing streets, cars, and homes under muddy, rushing water. In some areas, the flood rose so quickly that people barely had time to escape. Water rushed through houses, breaking doors and windows as it forced its way inside. Soon the water reached terrifying levels. In several towns along the riverbanks, entire homes were nearly submerged. The flood climbed past doorways, past windows, and in some places even reached the roofs of buildings. Families trapped inside were forced to climb higher and higher through their homes, moving from the ground floor to the upper rooms, and finally onto rooftops as the water continued to rise beneath them. From above, the scene was terrifying. Rows of houses stood half-buried beneath dark floodwater, with only rooftops and chimneys visible above the current. Across those rooftops, people could be seen waving their arms, shouting for help, or holding pieces of cloth in the air in hopes that someone would see them. Some held their children close as they stood on the roofs. Others climbed onto water tanks or narrow ledges, trying to stay above the rushing water that surrounded them on every side. Fear spread quickly as the current continued to grow stronger, carrying debris through the streets that had now become violent rivers. Cars floated past like abandoned objects. Wooden furniture, broken fences, and tree branches spun through the water as the flood tore through entire neighborhoods. When the force of the current made it impossible for many people to move through the streets, even on foot. Across the region, emergency sirens began echoing through the rain. Rescue teams rushed toward the flooded towns as news of the disaster spread. Firefighters, police units, and volunteer rescue groups began arriving from nearby cities, bringing boats, ropes, and emergency equipment. Convoys of rescue vehicles moved quickly through the storm, heading toward the worst-affected areas of the Black Sea region. But reaching the trapped residents was not easy. The floodwater was moving with frightening speed. In many streets, the current was so strong that even rescue boats struggled to move against it. The muddy water hid obstacles beneath the surface, including fallen trees, damaged power lines, and pieces of broken buildings carried by the flood. Some rescuers tried throwing ropes to people stranded on rooftops. The others maneuvered small boats between buildings, carefully approaching families waiting above the water. In several dramatic rescues, people were lifted from rooftops one by one and pulled into rescue boats as the current surged around them. But in other places, the water was simply too violent. Boats were forced to turn back as waves of rushing floodwater pushed through narrow streets like powerful river channels. Rescuers shouted instructions through megaphones, urging trapped residents to stay on their rooftops until help could reach them safely. Above the chaos, helicopters soon appeared in the dark sky. Their blades thundered over the flooded towns as crews searched for people trapped by the rising water. Rescue workers lowered ropes toward rooftops, where families waited in fear, pulling survivors up one by one into the aircraft. Yet even with rescuers pouring into the region, the flood continued to spread. Rain still fell heavily from the dark storm clouds overhead, feeding the rivers that had already overflowed their banks. Each passing hour brought new reports of flooded streets and trapped residents. For many people witnessing the destruction, the scene felt like something described in ancient scripture when waters rose with unstoppable force. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. Psalm 93:3. Across the Black Sea region, as the floodwaters continued to surge through towns and villages, carrying debris, destroying homes, and trapping families above the rushing current. And as the storm clouds continued to gather above the land, many feared that the worst might still be ahead. Even as floodwaters continued to surge through parts of the Black Sea region, another terrifying element of the storm began to reveal itself. High above the dark clouds that covered the land, and the atmosphere was growing more violent by the minute. Powerful currents of cold air collided with rising warm air inside the storm, forming towering thunderclouds that churned like enormous mountains in the sky. What began falling from those clouds next would leave many residents shocked. At first, only a few small pieces of ice struck the ground. They bounced lightly across roads and rooftops, surprising people who had already been watching the storm with growing concern. But within seconds, the sound changed. The sky began releasing something far more powerful. Large hailstones suddenly began falling from the clouds. They struck the ground with sharp cracking sounds, hitting rooftops, cars, and pavement with frightening force. What had started as scattered pieces of ice quickly turned into a violent hailstorm as dozens, then hundreds of frozen stones rained down across streets and neighborhoods. The noise was overwhelming. Hail hammered against metal rooftops like a storm of stones. Windows rattled as the ice slammed into glass. People standing outside ran for cover as the sky continued to unleash the icy barrage. Some hailstones were nearly the size of golf balls. Others were even larger. When they struck the ground, they shattered into pieces, sending fragments of ice scattering across sidewalks and roads. Cars parked outside quickly began showing signs of damage. Windshields cracked under the impact. Dents appeared across hoods and roofs as the frozen stones continued to fall. In some places, the hail fell so heavily that streets quickly became covered with layers of white ice. Drivers who had been trying to escape the storm suddenly found themselves slowing down or stopping entirely as visibility dropped and the road surface became dangerous. Many vehicles pulled to the side of the road while their drivers waited inside, hoping the hailstorm would pass before their cars were completely damaged. Across residential neighborhoods, the sound of hail striking rooftops echoed through the storm. Tiles on some roofs cracked under repeated impacts. Metal sheets rattled violently as the ice pounded against them again and again. Small skylights shattered in some homes, allowing rain and ice to fall directly into the rooms below. Residents rushed indoors as quickly as they could. People ran from sidewalks into shops and apartment buildings, holding their arms above their heads to protect themselves from the falling ice. Some grabbed umbrellas or bags in an attempt to shield themselves, but the hailstones were too large and too powerful to stop easily. Parents called for their children to come inside immediately. Street vendors abandoned their stands as the ice began striking their tables and carts. In a matter of minutes, the outdoor markets that had been full of activity were suddenly empty as people rushed for shelter. Even animals reacted to the sudden violence of the storm. Birds scattered from rooftops, searching for protection beneath bridges and buildings. Pets ran toward doorways as their owners pulled them inside. Above the chaos, thunder continued rolling through the clouds. Lightning flashed deep inside the towering storm system, illuminating the hailstorm below for brief moments at a time. For some watching the destruction unfold, the scene brought to mind ancient words describing storms that seemed to come with overwhelming force. He loads the thick cloud with moisture. The clouds scatter his lightning. Job 37:11. The storm over Turkey continued to grow more violent. Rain, wind, hail, and thunder now moved together in a powerful system, spreading destruction across towns and countryside alike. At what had begun as dark clouds in the sky had now become a full display of nature's fury. And yet, even as the hail continued to fall, the storm was far from finished. If you are still watching, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. As the storm over Turkey continued to intensify, the sky above seemed to grow even more unstable. Dark clouds churned violently, twisting and rolling over one another like enormous waves in the atmosphere. Thunder echoed across the land while rain and hail continued to pound rooftops and streets below. For many people watching the sky that day, it already felt as if the storm had reached its most destructive point. But what appeared next would shock even those who had already witnessed the storm's terrifying power. Within the massive storm clouds, a strange movement began to form. High above the ground, the clouds started rotating slowly, almost like a giant wheel turning in the sky. At first, it was difficult to see clearly through the rain and darkness, but the motion soon became unmistakable. The center of the cloud formation began pulling downward, stretching toward the earth, as if the storm itself was reaching out with a massive hand. Then it happened. A funnel-shaped column of swirling wind emerged from the cloud, though the spinning mass of air twisted downward from the storm like a dark rope descending from the sky. Slowly at first, then faster, the funnel stretched lower and lower until it finally touched the ground. A tornado had formed. The moment the rotating column connected with the earth, the power of the wind multiplied dramatically. Dust and debris were immediately pulled upward into the spinning vortex. Loose branches lifted from the ground. Leaves, dirt, and fragments of broken wood began swirling through the air as the tornado gathered strength. Within seconds, the destruction began. The powerful funnel of wind moved across fields and roads, tearing through anything that stood in its path. Trees that had already been weakened by the storm suddenly snapped as the rotating wind ripped through their branches. Some trees were pulled completely from the ground, their roots exposed as the tornado hurled them aside. Roofs trembled violently as the spinning winds passed nearby. In several places, pieces of metal roofing were ripped loose and flung through the air like sheets of paper. Wooden fences collapsed as the tornado crossed farmland, scattering boards and debris across the fields. Small structures such as sheds and barns were torn apart in seconds. The sound of the tornado was unlike anything most residents had ever heard. Witnesses later described it as a deep, roaring noise, similar to the sound of a powerful jet engine or a freight train rushing through the air. The wind screamed as it spun faster and faster, pulling everything into its rotating column. People who saw the funnel approaching ran desperately for shelter. Some rushed inside buildings while others sought protection in basements or interior rooms away from windows. Those caught outside could only watch in shock as the towering column of wind carved a path across the landscape. Above the chaos, the lightning continued flashing inside the dark storm clouds, illuminating the spinning tornado for brief moments at a time. For some witnesses, the terrifying scene brought to mind ancient words describing the power of storms and whirlwinds. The Lord has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm. Nahum 1:3. The tornado continued moving across the land, carrying debris high into the sky, while rain and thunder roared around it. Trees, branches, and fragments of rooftops spiraled through the air as the storm unleashed one of its most violent displays of power. And as the funnel twisted across the landscape beneath the dark sky, many people watching realized that the storm had now reached a level of destruction they had never imagined. As the storm continued sweeping across the region, many believed they had already witnessed the worst of its fury. Torrential rain flooded the lowlands, rivers burst beyond their banks, and powerful winds had torn through towns and fields. But far above the flooded valleys, in the higher mountains and colder elevations, the storm revealed yet another shocking turn that few people expected. While the lower regions struggled under relentless rain and rising floodwaters, the air in the higher terrain grew colder and colder as the storm climbed into the mountains. The powerful system moving across the region carried enormous masses of moisture and unstable air, and, as those clouds rose into the colder atmosphere above the highlands, the rain began to change. What fell from the sky, there was no longer rain. It was snow. At first, only a few flakes appeared, drifting slowly through the wind like small white sparks against the dark sky. Residents in the mountainous areas looked out their windows in disbelief as the temperature dropped rapidly and the rain suddenly transformed into swirling snow. But the snowfall did not remain gentle for long, and within minutes the wind intensified again, whipping the falling snow through the air with violent force. What had begun as scattered flakes quickly turned into a raging snowstorm as thick clouds released heavy waves of snow across the mountain roads, forests, and villages. Visibility dropped almost instantly. The wind drove the snow sideways across the slopes, covering roads and buildings in thick layers of white. Cars traveling through mountain passes were forced to slow down or stop entirely, as the road ahead vanished into a wall of blowing snow. The scene felt almost surreal. In the valleys below, people were struggling through floodwater and pounding rain, while high above them, the same storm was burying entire landscapes beneath ice and snow. Nature seemed completely out of balance. Residents in the mountain villages rushed to prepare for the sudden blizzard. Doors were shut tightly against the freezing wind, while people pulled heavy coats around their shoulders and looked out at the rapidly whitening landscape. Snow piled up on rooftops and along narrow mountain roads. Branches of pine trees bent under the growing weight as the storm continued dumping snow across the highlands. The wind howled through the mountain valleys, sending waves of snow swirling through the air like white smoke. Some drivers who had been traveling through the mountains suddenly found themselves trapped as the roads became dangerously icy. Vehicles pulled to the side of the road while their drivers waited inside, hoping the storm would ease before the snow blocked their path completely. The strange contrast between flood and blizzard left many people stunned. In one part of the country, rising waters threatened homes and towns. In another, the same storm was freezing the landscape beneath layers of snow. It was as if the elements themselves had turned against the land. Thunder continued to rumble through the clouds as lightning flashed across the sky above the mountains, briefly illuminating the swirling snowstorm. For some observers, the chaotic weather brought to mind words written long ago about the power of storms and snow. He says to the snow, "Fall on the earth, and to the rain shower, be a mighty downpour." Job 37:6. The storm system continued moving across Turkey, unleashing rain, wind, flood, hail, and now snow in different regions at the same time. What had begun as a dark sky and rising wind had now become something far more unpredictable. Across the land, many people watching the chaos unfold could only reach one conclusion. Nature itself seemed completely out of control. As if the storm had not already brought enough destruction, another terrifying moment arrived that no one had expected. Across parts of the region, people were still trying to recover from the relentless chaos of wind, flood, hail, and snow. Emergency crews were moving through flooded streets, residents were clearing debris from roads, and families were gathering outside their damaged homes, hoping the worst had finally passed. But beneath the soaked ground and battered cities, another force was waiting. Then, suddenly, the earth moved. At first it was subtle, almost like a distant vibration passing through the ground. And some people standing inside their homes felt a faint tremor beneath their feet, the kind that makes you pause for a moment and wonder if something has shifted. But, within seconds, the shaking grew stronger. Walls began to tremble. Windows rattled violently inside buildings. Furniture shifted slightly across floors as the ground continued to shake beneath entire neighborhoods. What had begun as a small tremor quickly turned into something far more serious. The earthquake had begun. Across towns and villages, people felt the sudden motion of the earth beneath them. Houses creaked as the structure of buildings strained against the movement. Hanging lights swayed back and forth, and objects on shelves began falling to the floor. Fear spread instantly. Families rushed toward doors and stairways, trying to escape buildings as quickly as possible. Some shouted warnings to their neighbors, while others grabbed their children and ran outside into open streets. Outside, the shaking was even more terrifying. Cars parked along the roads began rocking slightly as the ground trembled beneath them. Power lines swayed overhead, while the sound of rumbling earth echoed through the air. In some places, small cracks appeared in walls and pavement as the movement continued. People stood in shock, staring at the ground as it moved beneath their feet. Many residents had already endured hours of destructive weather. Floods had swallowed roads, hail had damaged homes, and violent winds had torn through fields and towns. But now the very ground itself seemed to join the chaos. Some people fell to their knees in fear. Others lifted their voices in prayer as the shaking continued. In moments like these, many remembered words from the Bible that described the earth trembling under overwhelming power. The earth trembled and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains shook. Psalm 18:7. The tremor lasted only a short time, but for those experiencing it, the seconds felt much longer. Slowly, the shaking began to fade. Buildings stopped rattling, power lines steadied, and the ground returned to stillness. But the fear remained. Residents stood silently in the streets, looking back at their homes and buildings, unsure of what damage might have been left behind. Some people checked their families and neighbors to make sure everyone was safe. Others simply stared at the sky, still dark with storm clouds, trying to process everything that had just happened. In a single day, the region had experienced powerful storms, devastating floods, destructive hail, violent winds, blinding snow, and now an earthquake. For many witnesses, it felt like the climax of a terrifying chain of disasters. Nature had unleashed nearly every force it possessed. And in that moment, standing among flooded streets and trembling ground, many people realized they had just lived through one of the most dramatic and frightening sequences of natural events they had ever seen. As the disaster unfolded across Turkey, the dramatic scenes did not remain confined to the affected regions for long. Videos recorded by witnesses during the storm quickly spread across social media and international news networks. Footage showing dark clouds covering the sky, violent winds tearing through streets, floodwaters swallowing neighborhoods, and families waiting on rooftops for rescue captured the attention of millions of viewers around the world. Messages of concern and support soon began appearing online. People from many different countries shared prayers and words of encouragement for the communities facing the destruction. Across social media, thousands of users expressed sympathy and hoped for the safety of those affected by the storm and flooding. Meanwhile, rescue operations continued across the region. The emergency teams worked through flooded streets and damaged neighborhoods, using boats and helicopters to reach residents who were still trapped. Volunteers and neighbors also stepped forward, helping distribute supplies and offering shelter to families who had lost their homes. Even in the midst of destruction, moments of compassion and unity appeared. Pray for the people affected. And let us know in the comments where you are watching from.
Something felt wrong before anyone could explain why. The animals reacted first. The sky didn't look the same, and people across the country began sharing moments that didn't seem to fit together, until they did. No single event was large enough to explain the feeling. Yet together, they left many asking the same question: what is really happening right now in the United States? The stability we rely on is being tested. If you believe these events may be signs calling us back to God, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel as we explore them through the light of faith and Scripture. Before anyone looked at the sky, the sheep began to run. It happened suddenly, no warning, no sound loud enough to explain it. One moment they were calm, scattered across the field, and the next they exploded into motion. Bodies collided. Dust rose into the air. The flock spun in confusion, rushing in different directions as if trying to escape something none of them could see. They weren't running toward safety. They were running from something unseen, something that seemed to exist just beyond human awareness. People watching froze. There was no storm on the horizon, no predator, no signal that danger was near, and yet the panic was real. The animals moved like they were responding to a command written into instinct itself. Cameras were lifted almost automatically, hands shaking slightly, as if everyone felt the same unspoken thought. Why are they reacting like this? What made the moment so unsettling was the silence around it. The air felt heavy, strangely still, as though the world was holding its breath. The sky looked normal. Phones showed no alerts. Satellites reported nothing unusual. And yet, right in front of human eyes, nature was already responding to something first. For as long as people have observed the natural world, stories have repeated the same pattern: animals reacting before earthquakes, before storms, before sudden shifts no one saw coming. Long before satellites scan the atmosphere or instruments register change, living creatures sometimes move as if they already know. Science may explain it through vibration, pressure, or senses sharper than our own. But standing there, watching chaos unfold without a visible cause, explanations feel distant. What remains is the feeling that something has begun before we even realize it. And that is where the tension starts to grow. Because if nature reacts before our machines, then maybe the first warning never comes from technology at all. Maybe it begins quietly, in movement, in instinct, in a moment most people would dismiss if they weren't there to see it. No one is telling you what this means. No one is forcing an answer. But as you watch, and one question keeps returning: were the animals simply panicking, or were they sensing something humanity hasn't noticed yet? The panic of the sheep was only the beginning. A short time after the flock scattered in chaos, the atmosphere changed, quickly. Across the plains near Amarillo, Texas, the wind rose with shocking force, slamming into the land as if something unseen had been unleashed.